hazards. We're talking about those very specific things that have the potential to cause a disaster, such as a hurricane or earthquake or a volcanic eruption, right? So those are hazards. Now, the disaster is the destructive result, because you can, in fact, have hazards and they don't necessarily destructively affect an area. So there's no disaster, right? So you want to ensure that you are using the terminology correctly as you write your essay. So we're focusing on that particular essay as we go through. Now, if you're doing this essay, you still need to know. So while you're focusing on the mitigation strategies, you still need to know something about the various kinds of hazards that are there. And that's precisely what we're going to do now. And you want to give a general understanding of this in your introduction before you go on to giving your thesis statement, which will then focus directly on the mitigation strategies. And we're coming to that. So the geology of the Caribbean, let us remind ourselves of that. We looked at this before when we were locating and defining the Caribbean. All right, so we talked about plate tectonics, and we talked about tectonic activities and seismic activities that affect the Caribbean. And we said that the Caribbean plate is the central defining feature when we're talking about these things in the Caribbean. Volcanoes, earthquakes, mountain building, tsunamis come under all of that. All right, so this is the Caribbean plate. We're reminding ourselves of what it looks like and the area that it covers. All right, and we're going to focus on this area very specifically as when we talk about plate margins and so on. All right, so here's another view of it that could help us to get a better picture of it. And we're noticing that the Caribbean plate borders North American plate, South American plate, Cocos plate, Nazca plate, and so on. All right, so we're just reminding ourselves of those things. So let's look at earthquakes just very generally now. These are caused by a sudden release of slowly accumulated strain energy along a fault in the Earth's crust. So the earthquakes and volcanoes occur most commonly at the collision zone between tectonic plates. And plates can either be convergent, which means that they are moving towards each other, divergent, which means that they're moving away from, or transform. They're moving alongside each other. And we find that with the Caribbean situation, we do have more of a convergent and transform situation than we have divergent along the Caribbean area. So earthquakes represent a particularly severe threat due to the irregular timing and intervals between them, and you really don't know. There's no real prediction of earthquakes, even though based on where places are located and the fault lines that are known and the plates and so on and the plate movements, there are attempts to actually make people aware that earthquakes could be happening. So there are monitoring systems that are in place, but you really cannot time an earthquake down like that. All right, so here is a picture of how when an earthquake occurs and there are cracks on the surface. All right, so this is what it looks like. Volcanoes now, these are perforations in the Earth's crust, and we just saw a video that shows us directly how volcanoes occur, how they happen. And the hazards that are associated or the disaster that may come as a result are falling ash, projectiles, mud flows, toxic gases, and so on. And volcanic activity may also trigger other hazardous events, including tsunamis. Now, it is said that the idea of a tsunami is actually not so common in the Caribbean and not much likely, but it could still happen. All right? So, obviously, we know what erupting volcanoes would look like. Now, let's look at some very specific volcanoes in the Caribbean. All right, so we have a transform plate margin in the Greater Antilles, but only extinct volcanoes are said to be along this area, or dormant volcanoes. So we don't have much activity in the Greater Antilles area. But there is a convergent plate margin along the Lesser Antilles, and this gives rise to a number of volcanoes along a certain path. All right, so we have Martinique, and that one is called Mount Pelée, and that erupted in 1902. Montserrat, which is very, very, very active, Sulphur Hills, erupted in 1995 and then 2003, and an entire section of the island, including the capital, Plymouth, had to be evacuated, and nobody lives there because of the activities that took place there. And that volcano is a very, very active one. And then we have St. Vincent, Mount Sulphur, that also erupted in 1902. And I think that this one gave rise to Mount Pelée. And then you have off the coast of Grenada, not quite on the island, off the coast, a submarine volcano that is called Kikemjeni. You may have heard of this particular one. All right, so this is the area we're talking about here, over this side, right here. And if you notice, when we saw where the plate margin, the Caribbean plate margin is, it's right outside of the area here, this archipelago that is the Lesser Antilles. And so you do have a number, I think the number is about 17 active volcanoes in that area alone. So the Lesser Antilles, very, very active when it comes on to volcanoes, but not so active in the Greater Antilles. All right. So tsunamis, as we said, these are long period waves, very high waves that are generated whenever there is a kind of severe movement of either earthquakes or volcanic activity. And we do not necessarily have much examples of tsunamis occurring in the Caribbean, but we do know that parts of Asia and that Ring of Fire area, they have a very high possibility of tsunamis taking place. That doesn't mean that we should not be on high alert. So there we have it, these high waves. We don't have these in the Caribbean. Mainly the ones we have are for surfing, right? And we enjoy those. Now, hurricanes, this is the one we are very, very familiar with, because the Caribbean area is directly along the path that hurricanes normally take. And hurricanes are formed off the coast of Africa, West Africa, and they travel into the Caribbean area. And so we're very, very familiar with this. We have a long hurricane period. Do you know the hurricane period? You should know, because we're always on high alert at this time. Lots of media attention and so on. All right, so these are tropical into severe storms, and there is a process. They begin as a wave, then a depression, and then a tropical storm, and then a hurricane. And then there are different levels of the hurricane. So you have categories 1 to 5. All right, so they are generated over warm ocean water at low altitudes, and then of course as they go along they can leave a path of destruction. And don't we know that all too well? Winds exceeding 64 knots, heavy rainfall, storm surges, these are the common things that we see when we talk about a hurricane occurring in the Caribbean. All right, so there we have it. This is how a hurricane looks. Now, we know of some examples of devastating hurricanes that have taken place in the Caribbean, right? And the most famous, perhaps, for us in Jamaica is Gilbert, 1988. I was a teeny tiny baby, I don't recall. And then you have Ivan, 2004. Many persons would recall Ivan because Ivan is in very near memory. I recall Ivan very, very well. And there was quite a bit of destruction for Ivan. Katrina, we know that Katrina left a very devastating path, going all the way up into Louisiana and so on. Dennis. No, Dennis, I definitely recall Dennis. And I'm not telling you why I recall Dennis. Also, Dean. Daniel, and we've had much more recent ones because every hurricane season we have been having these. And this particular hurricane season that we're just coming out of, because it goes to November 30, so we're coming out of. And this particular season is the most active to date, the most active hurricane season. And every year we keep saying that the season is becoming more and more active. Why? Because of global warming. Climate change is causing a number of these things. We have some disaster statistics here. And if you notice Haiti's statistics, because for some reason or the other, there have been a number of disasters that have taken place with Haiti, hurricanes, earthquakes, and so on. All right, and this is over a period of about 5 years or so. All right, so let's get to the heart of the question now. The question asks us to talk about mitigation strategies. When we talk about mitigation, what do we mean? We are talking about measures to prevent or minimize death and destruction through anticipation and the successful implementation of these strategies. And mitigation is taking place before and during and even afterwards. For example, with an earthquake, because there are aftershocks and there's the possibility of a tsunami, and so you have to continue the work even after an earthquake occurs. So mitigation is in all of those stages. But there are different levels of mitigation. We do mitigation on an individual, community, national, and regional level. So in your essay, you need to make this clear. When you're writing that thesis statement and when you're giving your ideas for these mitigation strategies, this is what you're going to use. And what you can do is you can actually use these levels, these markers, to form your paragraphs. So after you've given your thesis statement in your introduction, then you can use these to form your paragraphs. So you discuss the individual level, you discuss the community, you discuss the national and then the regional level. And there you have your essay coming together. All right, so let's get into this now. On an individual level, it means you, in your home, your family, what is it that you do? And remember, we have looked at earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, and hurricanes. So all of those are included in this band where we're talking about mitigation strategies. You want to ensure you have an emergency kit in the home, right? Medication, if you have elderly people or people with any other kind of diseases, you want to ensure you have all of that. Band-aids, anything that is important for you just in case somebody gets hurt. You need to have that emergency kit. You need to have an evacuation route or plan. So you and your family need to get together and do some drilling. So if an earthquake should occur, what is it that everybody should do? From the youngest child in the home, what should everybody do? Right? So this is something that you need to discuss as a family. You need to know what it is that you're supposed to do. The reinforcement of the infrastructure. And many times we hear hurricanes coming, you see everybody up on the roof knocking with their hammer and getting hurricane straps and all kinds of things. Reinforcing the infrastructure just in case something terrible really happens, right? And you want to get insurance too. You want to insure your place. Just in case anything happens, you have some money to fall back on in order to help you to recover. I remember very clearly that in Dean, there was a total destruction of my house. We didn't have any insurance, so you know what happened right there. And so, of course, I determined that should not happen again. And then you want to secure personal belongings, your passport and your birth certificate and all of these things. You want to put them together in a bag or a container that, it's not porous, and ensure that they are safe. Right? And in Jamaica, we say, take care of your surfy ticket. Make sure you find your surfy ticket. So these are the things you want to do on an individual level. So you discuss these things in your essay. All right, we have to move swiftly along, Now, on the community level, communities should come together, designate and organize a shelter just in case something goes wrong. Right? Where is it that people can go? Is it the community center? Is there a church? Is there a school? These are the things that you want to make sure that the community knows. Identify the flood-prone areas and begin to look out for the people, especially elderly people or people in wheelchairs who are not able to move, people with a disability. you want to take care of those people and you want to look out for those people in the community. And you can probably form your own local community disaster management team, right? Work alongside the local government, the parish council, in order to execute on a community level. All right, so there we have it now, the Caribbean governments. This is the part we want to get to, because when you talk about mitigation on a national level, you're talking about the government. The government needs to have a plan in place. So the government needs to be proactive. One word sums that up: proactivity. We already know that we are mainly islands in the Caribbean. We already know that we are prone to hurricanes at a specific time. So you cannot sit down and wait until you hear say one hurricane a come. And then all of a sudden everybody is scrambling around, which is what we normally do, right, in Jamaica. So the legalities must be in place, right? The laws that must be in place for building and settlement restrictions. And so many times we see people living on the gully bank or certain areas, and we know that when something happens, there's going to be a lot of destruction. See, the other day in a part of St. Andrew, landslides, severe landslides. And it had a lot to do with where people built their houses in areas that were falling down. Those were not places to build houses in the first place. And then you come to the social issues and people will say, people don't have any choice, But the government must be proactive in ensuring that people don't build in certain areas. National Disaster Preparedness Plan. We need to have a plan. There must be a plan in place. So in case of anything, this is what will happen. These are the groups that will roll out. These are the things that will now come into effect. The establishment of national disaster management agencies. Right? So you need to have these agencies that are responsible for this thing. And they are the ones who take the forefront. Right? NGOs included too. Education and re-socialization of people. Re-socialization. So important. Because in Jamaica we have a style, When we hear a hurricane come, no hurricane nah come no way. No hurricane nah come no way. Me say, yes, me born and grow, me nah move from yes, so. And this is the kind of attitude that we have. And we continue and we stay there. And then now when the hurricane come, we up on top of the house and we are wait for helicopter come carry we out. When we should have moved because, the disaster is real. And sometimes we don't take it serious, but sometimes we do. And you go to the supermarket and you cannot get no mackerel and no sardine because everybody, we are stocking up on these things, We must have a disaster budget. Because we know the thing go, we know the thing set. You must have a disaster budget. All Caribbean governments must. And so we have some examples here of Caribbean disaster management agencies in the individual countries, right? So in Trinidad, this is the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management, very similar to Jamaica's ODPM. And we have TEMA, Tobago Emergency Management Agency. So we do have Caribbean countries who have these things in place. But now on a Caribbean regional level, because this is another level of the discussion that you need to write in your essay, You have to talk about the Caribbean region and how it is that as a region, we handle disasters, right? So we have CIDEMA, which is the agency that is at the forefront, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, all right? And this agency is responsible for working together with Caribbean countries. And when it is that we have disasters of mammoth proportions, such as what took place last year and the year before in some smaller Caribbean islands with Matthew, I think it was, that was one of them. And there were a number of them that had a series of like three, one behind the other. And so the CIDEMA now comes in to ensure that as a Caribbean, we take care of each other, we help each other to manage how we deal with disasters. And coming out of CIDEMA, I came across the Caribbean Risk Information System. And this comes out of CIDEMA, all right? And this is a system, this is a platform a technological platform that they use to manage the system. So information, data is placed there, and so they use this to inform how they respond in the various Caribbean countries. So very, very important when you are writing that you write about all of these levels and flesh out the information before you go on to your conclusion. Now we have, as I did say to you, different levels of mitigation. So you have pre, you have during, and you have post. So pre-disaster mitigation. We want to ensure that certain things are in place. And when you look at Haiti, for example, in 2010 with that earthquake, part of the reason why Haiti was so devastated, was because of improper building codes, or there were none. No standards were there for buildings. And so when the earth shifted and the bottom of the building shifted, and then it's coming back into place and the top moves, and then the building crumbles because there were no proper standards in place. Now in Jamaica, we have the Bureau of Standards. How many of you students knew that there's a certain amount of sand and a certain amount of cement and whatever else they put into that concrete mix? You'd have to ask a mason or so. There is a certain amount that you have to put in order to meet the building requirements, even for blocks. So you don't just go anywhere and buy blocks. One little man say must sell blocks. You need to ask. You need to find out if they're meeting the standards. Because next thing you know, you go and buy blocks and they're cheap, cheap, cheap. And you build up your house nice, nice, nice. And then when the earthquake comes, it mash it down, down, down. So you want to be careful of what you are doing. And this is what the Bureau of Standards is for. And not just in terms of the mix, but also public buildings, for example, must have certain entrance and exit points. So it cannot be just one way to go into the building and one way to come out. If anything should go wrong, what will happen? Everybody rushing to that one exit causes problems, stampede and all kinds of things. Right? Gathering areas must be a part of building. So you don't just use up the whole of the land and build up big building and there are no gathering areas just in case. So all of these things must be taken into consideration. And the Bureau of Standards is there to help us to navigate. So that is pre-disaster mitigation. And there are more things we could discuss. Students, do your reading. All right, and then we go to during a disaster. During a disaster, communication is crucial. It's important that the government and the agencies are able to reach to the people. Very important. So at this point, you have the councillors and the MPs on the ground and their workers on the ground, ensuring that you can get to persons. All right? Rescue teams are mobilized. So the Army and the Fire Department and other NGOs like Red Cross and so on are on the alert. International relief too comes in right there sometimes. And we go back to Haiti as an example in 2010. Now, with that devastation there in Haiti, they needed water, foodstuffs, drinking water that is, blankets, clothing, you name it, they needed it. And so you had the Salvation Army, Red Cross, the US and Caribbean governments sending our own people there to assist, to help during the disaster, because it was still going on. It was still happening. All right? People were displaced and everything. So not because the earthquake has occurred and it's finished means that the disaster is over. No, the disaster is still going on because the people are feeling the effects of it right now. Right? So as long as that is happening, the disaster is still on. All right? So that's during a disaster. Post-disaster. Look at what's happening here in these pics. We have down power lines. We have everything here is a mash up, It just mash up. All of the houses mash up. And then over here now, flooding. So these are three different things that are happening there post-disaster. So you want to ensure that you have the communication up as quick as possible. You want the utilities back up, the water and the light and so on, so people can talk to people. You want protection of the citizens, Uno see me dish, uno see me dish. Anybody, uno see me satellite dish. Anybody know that song? from Gilbert. Love in there, I don't quite know if Love in there did really have a satellite dish, you know. Me have a feeling say never really have any. But this is what we're talking about. Looting. People are taking over people's things and tearing down shops and supermarkets and so on. These are the things that take place. So you want to ensure the police and other protection people, agencies are out there working. You want capital injection for the recovery, money, because the people in house mash up and they need help. So you need capital injection from the government, right? And of course, you need the immediate things, the water and the food and the medication and these kinds of things. You do need those post-disaster. All right, we have a very, very short time period left. And we have looked at that particular question. So all you need to do now is write your conclusion, because you would have covered all of the things that are related to disaster mitigation by looking at it in that way. And I caution you again, don't just lump up everything into one student when you are writing and just write as you feel in mind. No, strategize and begin to separate what you are going to do to form your paragraphs, and then of course you conclude. So let us conclude that and let us look at coral reefs now. This picture you're looking at is the barrier reef off the coast of Belize, one of the second largest barrier reef in the world. And we are discussing the importance of coral reefs to Caribbean society and culture. And this question, 30 marks or maybe 20 marks. What are corals and what are coral reefs? Tiny marine creatures are corals that secrete calcium carbonate, which is limestone, and around their bodies. And then after a while, all of these cemented together are what form coral reefs. But coral reefs are just more than that. They are ecosystems that are formed from the growth of these same coral polyps in the one area, usually along the shorelines of Caribbean countries, right? And so all of that put together over time becomes the coral reef. So why is it so important? Why is it so important that we look at this? And I mentioned the barrier reef of Belize. That's the only barrier reef we have. And there are 3 different types of reefs. You have fringing reefs. Most Caribbean islands have fringing reefs. We have those. All right. And then you have atolls. We don't have a lot of those, but maybe 1 or 2 in the Caribbean. And the fringing reefs are this kind of reef that grows along the coastline, right? And you'll see them jutting out from the coast all the way out into the sea sometimes. Where I am from, in St. Mary, this is very, very obvious, all right? So the coral reefs, very, very important. Why? Because of coastal protection. They provide protection from waves, high waves. As the waves beat in, right? The coral reefs protect the shoreline. Tourist activities. Yes, we do snorkeling, go on glass bottom boat, and we see the various flora and fauna that are formed from this ecosystem that is the coral reef. Growth of mangroves and wetlands, and this is important for the production of fish and other marine life, right? And so we need coral reefs. Now, what are the threats to coral reefs that we have in the Caribbean? We have natural threats and we have those made by humans. And the ones by humans, as you rightly guessed, these are the ones that give the most problem, right? So the natural threats, hurricanes, when the storm surges and the excess rain beating on the reefs can damage the reefs. Earthquakes too, volcanoes, tsunamis, all of those can affect the reef. All right? The Saharan dust in the dry season that comes off Africa and that travels through. This year we had a very, very, one of those difficult areas of Saharan dust. We had a lot of it. It can also damage the coral reefs, right? And global warming also does that. Human activity though, tourism. All right, so we depend a lot on our traditional type of tourism, the sun and the sand and that kind of thing, and people come to the Caribbean for that. And tourism is a huge selling point for most Caribbean countries. And so we over-tourism, if there is such a word. All right, and we break the coral off to sell as trinkets, and we paint them and all that kind of thing. Fishing practices, very bad fishing practices, overfishing, dynamite fishing, spear fishing, and that kind of thing. Industrial wastes, chemicals from factories, and all of those are threats to coral reefs. All right, so there we have the spear fishing and so on. All right, and when we look at an essay related to coral reefs and we talk about those things, we want to ensure that we are using point when we are writing our essays. We are making the point, we are explaining. No, I don't have a lot of time to do a lot of explanation today, but you should do your reading and be able to explain. All right? Give your examples from various Caribbean countries, and you make your link back to what it is saying. All right?